This episode contains graphic content that may not be suitable for all ages. Listener discretion is advised. If you or someone you know is struggling or in crisis, help is available. Call or text 988 or chat with someone at 988lifeline.org. Those outside of the US, reach out to someone at your local crisis center or hotline. Please do not suffer in silence. Inside Kansas City, Missouri rests a historic hotel, which may not look like it, but is home to one of America's strangest unsolved murders. Built in 1925, the Hotel President, or the President Hotel depending on who you ask, was part of Niagara Falls businessman Frank A. Dudley's string of successful hotels built in the early 20th century. It was constructed in an era when Kansas City was attempting to build up its Power and Light District, which is now one of the largest developmental projects in the entire Midwest. At the time the Hotel President opened in 1926, it had been built over many months and was considered by all who visited to be a great place to stay. So much so that it was chosen by the Republican Party to serve as its headquarters for the Republican National Convention in 1928. The year that they chose longtime administrator Herbert Hoover to become their nominee, an election that he would end up winning, much to the chagrin of many, including historians. But that's neither here nor there. Regardless, at the time today's story unfolded, the shine from the 1928 Republican Convention had yet to truly wear off. While it's true that the Hotel President was the only hotel in the Power and Light District at the time, it was still regarded as a nice place to stay that wasn't too expensive. Its affordability is actually what drew a peculiar guest to the hotel in the early days of 1935, launching a mystery that endures nearly an entire century later. This is the story of Room 1046. Part 1. Roland T. Owen. At around 1:20 p.m. on Wednesday, January 2nd, 1935, a young man arrived at the Hotel President. Carrying no luggage with him at the time, the young, well-dressed man asked for an interior room several floors up. He paid for his day's rent in advance, something he would do the following day as well. When asked, he gave his name as Roland T. Owen, telling hotel staff that he was from Los Angeles. Per his request, he was assigned room 1046. Hotel staff would later describe the guest as pretty physically unremarkable. He was white, with dark hair, and none of his features were really significant. His age was tough to determine, with most believing him to be in his mid-30s, while others pegged him as being in his early to mid-20s. Yet he did have a few physical characteristics that would come into play later on. A visible scar on his temple, which he tried to hide by combing over his hair, as well as cauliflower ear on his left ear, indicating he was a wrestler or a fighter of some kind. He was well dressed, wearing a dark overcoat over a suit, but he carried no possessions with him. At least, none that were visible. A bellhop, Randolph Probst, accompanied Owen up to his room on the 10th floor, speaking to him briefly as they walked. The new guest told the bellhop that he had spent the previous night at another nearby hotel, the Muehlebach Hotel, but found its nightly rate of $5 to be a bit too much, a cost of roughly $115 in modern currency. The two then made it up to room 1046, which, per Owen's request, was an interior room on an upper floor. The room had a view overlooking the hotel's courtyard. After walking into the room, Owen then began emptying the pockets of his overcoat, revealing that he carried a hairbrush, a comb, and a toothbrush with him. Randolph Probst, the bellhop, waited until Owen finished unpacking, and the two then began walking back downstairs. Probst locked the door behind both of them, and then handed Owen the key to his room. While the room could be locked from the inside, it could also be locked from the outside via a key, and Owen would maintain possession of this key throughout the rest of his stay, never again handing it over to hotel staff. After making it back down to the hotel lobby, Owen then left out the front door, headed out to destinations unknown. Staff did not see him arrive back at the hotel, but he apparently did just a short time later. Early that afternoon, a maid would enter room 1046 for housekeeping. Mary Soptic, having had the prior day off of work, was surprised to find the guest, Roland T. Owen, inside the room when she walked in. She expected to see a female guest who had been staying in the room when she had last worked. However, the circumstances of this encounter made the entire ordeal unsettling to Mary. When she had entered into the unlocked room and found Owen sitting inside, he had been immersed in darkness. He kept the shades to the room drawn, and only had on one rather dim lamp on a table for light. Yet, he seemed unperturbed by Mary's presence. She later recalled in a statement to police, reported in the January 6th edition of the Kansas City Star. He told me to come in and go ahead with fixing the room. The shades were drawn and the light from the desk lamp was dim. My impression of this man from the expressions on his face and from his actions was that he was either worried about something or afraid. He always wanted to keep in the dark. He put on his overcoat, combed his hair, and told me he was going out and not to lock the door when I left, because he was expecting a friend. When I was cleaning the room, I observed the note on the writing desk. It read, "Dawn, I will be back in 15 minutes. Wait." Roland T. Owen left the hotel yet again, heading out to somewhere unknown to staff, and the housekeeper, Mary Soptic, did as he had requested. When she was done cleaning the room, she left the door unlocked. She returned a few hours later with fresh towels, and was again surprised by Owen's presence in the dark room. Mary's statement to police read, "At 4 o'clock Wednesday afternoon, I returned to the room with towels, and Owen was laying across the bed with the room dark. The lights were out." At this point, Mary and the other hotel staff began to share whispers about their strange new guest, theorizing that he was a drunk. Alcohol seemed to be the only thing to explain away his strange behavior. But little did they know that Owen's behavior that Wednesday was only a precursor for what was to come. The following morning, at around 10:30 on Thursday, January 3rd, 1935, Mary Soptic returned to clean room 1046. The door was locked from the outside, indicating that the new hotel guest had stepped out. However, after unlocking the door with her passkey and stepping inside, Mary was surprised to find Roland T. Owen sitting inside, again in the dark, just as he had been the day before, with the shades drawn and the dim table lamp on. She did not know why the door had been locked from the outside, but Mary undoubtedly did not want to know. Her statement to police, given the following day, read, "At 10:30 o'clock Thursday, I went to the room and unlocked it, believing the guest was out. I walked in and found this man sitting there with the lights off and the shades drawn. I realized after I unlocked this door that the man had been locked in from the outside. While in the room, I heard a conversation Owen had over the telephone. He was saying, 'No, Dawn, I don't want to eat. I am not hungry. I just had breakfast.'" Mary went about her business inside room 1046, cleaning it and striking up a brief conversation with the guest, who sat in the dark and asked her about her job. He asked Mary if she was responsible for cleaning up the entire floor, and again voiced his complaints about the nearby Muehlebach Hotel, the same ones he had raised a day prior in a conversation with the bellhop. Soon after, Mary finished cleaning the room and left. Mary would return again at around 4 p.m., again with some fresh towels. As she approached the door, she could hear two men talking inside. One voice was Owen, the guest she had now encountered thrice, each time in darkness. The other voice was deeper, louder, a bit more gruff. She wasn't able to make out what the two were saying, but she interrupted their conversation with a brief knock. The man with the deeper voice asked who it was, and she told them she had brought fresh towels. The man with the deeper voice then replied, "No, we don't need any. We've got enough." Mary found this odd, as she had taken away all of the dirty, used towels earlier in the day when she had cleaned it, so she knew that there were no towels inside the room. Yet, she let the matter be, instead moving on to the next room. At around 11 p.m. that Thursday, a city worker driving through the Power and Light District, nearby the hotel president, happened upon a man dressed in an undershirt, pants, and shoes, who ran into the path of his vehicle and flagged him down. The driver, Robert Lane, came to a stop, and the other man apologized, believing he had been a taxi driver. Robert told the other man that he wasn't, but the other man asked if he could drive him to an area where taxis frequented. Robert told him he could, giving him a short lift to an area where he knew taxis waited for fares later at night. During the drive, Robert recalled saying to the man, "You look as if you've been in it bad." And that was the truth. This passenger, now sitting in the back seat, seemed to be bleeding from his arm, a wound that appeared to have been deeply cut. Robert believed this man was trying to cup the wound to prevent blood from spilling out. During their brief drive, the man would remark in an offhand comment that he was going to kill someone the next day. After a couple of blocks, Robert let the other man out, and the other man thanked him before climbing out and hailing down a taxi nearby. Later, Robert Lane would identify this strange man as the hotel president's new guest, Roland T. Owen. Yet, what circumstances may have led him to this strange encounter remain unknown to this day. That evening, guests on the 10th floor would report loud noises, which weren't isolated to any one room, yet painted a rather chaotic picture. In addition to a party going on in room 1055, there were constant trips up to the 10th floor through the elevator, with men and women coming and going from various rooms, talking loudly. Elevator operator Charles Blotcher, who began his shift at midnight, later told authorities that he was busy until roughly 1:30 a.m. Many of the residents seemed to be going up to their rooms or to the party in room 1055, but he did recall a couple of residents that came up in those early morning hours that struck him as odd. One was a woman he had seen a few times before, who he believed to be a sex worker. The other was a man that later accompanied her, who he had never seen before. In his statement to police, he recalled, "I took a woman that I'd recognized as being a woman who frequents the hotel with different men in different rooms. It is my impression from this woman's actions that she is a commercial woman. I took her to the 10th floor and she made inquiries for room 1026. About 5 minutes after this, I received a signal to come back to the 10th floor. Upon arriving there, I met the same woman and she wondered why he wasn't in his room because he had called her and had always been very prompt in his appointments, and she wondered if he might be in room 1024. She remained about 30 or 40 minutes, then I received a signal to go back to the 10th floor. I went back and this same woman appeared there and came down on the elevator with me and left the elevator at the lobby. About an hour later, she returned in company with a man and I took them to the 9th floor. I later received a signal to go to the 9th floor at about 4:15 a.m., and the same woman came down from the 9th floor and left the hotel. In a period of about 15 minutes later, this man came down the elevator from the 9th floor complaining that he couldn't sleep and was going out for a walk. Elevator operator Charles Blotcher would describe the man and woman he had seen that night as both standing around 5 feet 6 inches tall and weighing around 135 pounds. The man wore a light brown overcoat with a brown hat and shoes. The woman wore a coat of black Hudson seal or imitation Hudson seal, which had a light fur strip that stood up. Per his statement, this was a woman he had seen around the hotel beforehand, but the man was new to him. Blotcher would describe a few others leaving the hotel at around the same time, after 4 a.m. Among them was a pair of middle-aged women that left between 4 and 5 a.m., as well as a man carrying a Gladstone bag, who left between 5 and 6 a.m. A Gladstone bag, if you're unaware, like I was, is a type of old-timey suitcase that was used primarily by doctors at the turn of the 20th century to carry around medical equipment. So you've likely seen one, maybe in movies or TV, and just didn't know what it was called. A woman that was staying in the room next to 1046 would later report hearing laughing and talking in Roland T. Owen's room just after midnight. When speaking to police, this woman would state that she heard what sounded like two couples, 2 men and 2 women, laughing and talking until roughly 2 a.m. However, at that point, it seems like something happened, and the conversation between them turned sour, with the guest in the room beginning to use what she called abusive language towards each other between 2 and 3 a.m. She recalled the time because she had actually started to call down to the front desk to complain about the noise, but decided not to at the last second. This would later become notable because this woman recalled hearing what sounded like loud snoring at around 4 a.m. Keep that in mind as the story continues to unfold. Now, we're going to pause for just a moment. At around 7 a.m. that Friday, January 4th, the hotel's switchboard operator Della Ferguson came on shift. She was prepared to make a requested wake-up call to room 1046, but noticed that the light came on, indicating that the room's phone was off the hook. As such, she couldn't call it. She picked up the plug and repeatedly tried to say good morning, hoping that the guest had preemptively picked up the phone, but there was no response from the other end of the line, just silence. From here, it fell upon staff workers to head up to the room and either give the wake-up call directly or put the phone back on the hook. So the first to be dispatched up to room 1046 was none other than Randolph Probst, the bellhop that had first accompanied Roland T. Owen up to his room 2 days prior. He would go up there, noticing a Do Not Disturb sign placed on the door, but he did so anyways. In his statement to police, he later recalled, "I found the door locked, knocked several times and then heard a deep voice say, 'Come in.' The door was still locked, so I knocked again, and the same voice said, 'Turn on the lights.' I knocked some more, then told the man to put the telephone receiver on the hook. I returned to the hotel lobby and told the operator the man in 1046 apparently was drunk, and for her to wait an hour or so and send someone up to try and get the receiver put on the hook." At around 8:30, switchboard operator Della Ferguson noticed that the phone from room 1046 was still off of its receiver, so they were unable to make contact with the guest inside. Another bellhop, Harold Pike, was sent up to check in on the guest. When Harold arrived at the room, he noticed that the Do Not Disturb sign still hung on the door, and as Randolph Probst had recalled more than an hour earlier, the door was locked. Surprisingly, from the outside. But using his passkey, Harold Pike unlocked the door and stepped inside, finding the room dark. Again, the shades were drawn and the lights were off. With the faint light coming in from the hallway, Harold could see that the room's occupant was laying naked on the bed, facing the wall away from him. He recalled seeing some dark spots on the bedding, but thought little of it at the time. Believing the man laying there to be drunk and asleep, Harold reached toward the phone, laying on the floor, and put it back on the stand, before stepping out and leaving the room. A little over 2 hours later, Della Ferguson noticed that the receiver in room 1046 was again off of the hook, blocking any potential calls. So bellhop Randolph Probst found himself called up to the room yet again, the second time that morning. This time, he brought with him the passkey, allowing him to unlock doors that had been locked from the outside. He later told police. Then, at 11:03 o'clock, the operator told me to go back to 1046 and tell the man to put the receiver on the hook. I knocked loudly 3 times and got no response. I then used the passkey, and when I entered the room, the man was within 2 feet of the door, on his knees and elbows, holding his head in his hands. I noticed blood on his head. I turned the lights on, placed the receiver on the hook, and saw blood on the walls, on the bed, and in the bathroom. Roland T. Owen, nude and visibly injured, was bent down on all fours, his head hung low, revealing he had suffered a violent assault of some kind. Randolph Probst turned on the lights, illuminating what was a chaotic and bloody scene. A nearby chair was overturned. The bedding was in disarray, half on and half off the bed. It, like the walls and even the ceiling, were stained with streaks of blood. Seeing this, Probst then turned around to try and seek help. In his statement to police, he recalled, "This frightened me, and I left the room immediately and informed Mr. Weaver, assistant manager of the hotel. He and the manager and myself returned to the room and opened the door about 6 inches. The man was against the door and we could not open it farther, so we closed it and left. And shortly after this, I saw a doctor and the police there." By the time hotel staff came back up to the room, the injured man inside had wedged himself against the door, struggling to maintain his own consciousness, it seemed. Minutes later, police arrived, joined by Dr. Harold Flanders of the Kansas City General Hospital. They were able to get the nude injured guest away from the door, gaining access to the bizarre scene that lay on the other side of it. Having gained control of himself momentarily, Roland T. Owen stood, still nude and bloody, walking over to the bathroom. There, he sat on the edge of the bathtub, leaning over the wash bowl, where he tried to drink water from the faucet. Here, police and Dr. Flanders noted that the man had been bound, with the white cord still wrapped around his neck, his wrist, and his ankles. Dr. Flanders would cut the bindings, noting additional bruising around the man's neck, where someone had evidently tried to strangle him. A brief scan of the young man's body would reveal stab wounds to his chest, including one that pierced the region just north of his heart. Another had punctured one of the man's lungs. He had also suffered multiple blows to the head, resulting in a skull fracture. While Dr. Flanders attempted to treat the young man, cutting away the bindings and trying to stop the bleeding, one of the detectives that had arrived at the scene, Ira Johnson, began asking the man questions. In his dazed state, Owen was unable to answer much, struggling to find the words. "Who was here with you?" Detective Johnson asked. Nobody, Owen responded. How did you get hurt? Johnson. I fell against the bathtub. Owen. Did you try to commit suicide? No. Shortly thereafter, the man calling himself Roland T. Owen would lose consciousness. He would sadly never regain it. Having been rushed to a nearby hospital, the young man would become comatose. He remained in that state for a dozen or so hours, succumbing to his injuries shortly after midnight on Saturday, January 5th, 1935. The young man's death certificate was signed by County Coroner Dr. P.H. Owen, who bore no relation to the decedent. For reasons that we'll explore, he ruled the death a homicide. The guest, who had told the hotel that his name was Roland T. Owen, had been bound before his death. He had been stabbed multiple times in the chest, including a wound that pierced his lung. His wrists were slashed. There were several bruises on the right side of his head, and his skull had been fractured. He suffered a significant cut to his right ear. His hands were bruised, indicating he had been in a fight before his death. By all indications, he had been tortured and suffered his injuries roughly 6 to 7 hours before he was found in his room, based on the amount of dried blood found on him at the time of his discovery. This put the rough estimate for the attack at somewhere between 4 and 5 a.m. However, as investigators looked through the young man's hotel room, they discovered that virtually none of his belongings were there. They couldn't find any of his clothes, nor any of the regular hotel amenities, such as towels, soap, etc. Also missing were the young man's hairbrush and toothbrush, items that bellhop Randolph Probst had seen him take out of his pocket just 2 days prior. Neither was there a murder weapon in the room. Police believed that Owen had been stabbed by a thin knife, and its absence indicated to them that this was no suicide. The missing blade, paired with the bindings around the young man's neck, wrist, and ankles, indicated something sinister. As stated by Detective Ira Johnson to reporters a short time later, there is no doubt that someone else is mixed up in this. Based on multiple witness reports, it was believed that the attack on Owen had started between 2 and 4 a.m., during which time a loud conversation in his room had begun to turn sour. A neighbor in the room next door recalled hearing abusive language hurled at someone within the room, and investigators believed that the loud snoring noise that she heard at around 4 a.m. may have been, in fact, Owen struggling to breathe after getting stabbed in the lung. Despite being unable to find any of the man's belongings in the room or a murder weapon, there were a few items that police would begin to focus their investigation on. Among them were a couple of items found on a rug near the bed, which included an unsmoked cigarette, a woman's hairpin, and a necktie label for an item of clothing. The label indicated that the nondescript item of clothing had been made by the Botany Worsted Mills Company in Passaic, New Jersey. Other items of note in the room included a safety pin and a bottle of sulfuric acid, as well as the pieces of cord that had been used to bind the victim. These were white cotton wrapping cords, described as having the thickness of a thin pencil, similar to that used for clotheslines. The knots used to bind the victim were described as simple and/or amateurish, having been triple-tied. After dusting the room for fingerprints, investigators would find female fingerprints on 2 items of note: an unbroken glass in the bathroom, as well as on the telephone stand, with the telephone having been left off of the hook following this brutal attack. After ruling the young man's death as a homicide, authorities began making plans to lay him to rest. However, as they tried to locate his next of kin, they ran into a problem that ran beyond a simple homicide investigation. Try as they might, authorities could not locate any of the decedent's family members or friends. As far as they could tell, Roland T. Owen was not even his real name. As days turned into weeks, police and other officials struggled to determine the man's real identity. They would broadcast his description in local newspaper articles as a young white man between 25 and 30 years old, although even that was disputed, with the coroner estimating his age at around 20, but hotel staff putting him at 35 or so. Yet he stood around 5 feet 10 inches tall and weighed approximately 200 pounds, with brown, bushy hair and blue eyes, as well as a scar at the top of his head, which appeared to have come from an old burn. He combed his hair over the left side of his head to hide it, but the scar was described as being wedge-shaped, roughly 4.5 inches across, right above the left ear. In noting the bruises on his hands, authorities noted that they were not hands used to labor, yet his cauliflower ear gave the indication that he had been a fighter of some kind, possibly a boxer, but most likely a wrestler. Detective Ira Johnson, a former wrestler himself, noted the young man's unusual underarm muscular development, which he had only ever seen in fellow wrestlers. These descriptions would lead to multiple people reaching out to police and even hotel staff, claiming to have known the man. One such woman dialed the hotel president hours after the death had first been reported, asking the staff for a description of the man. When they gave it to her, she responded, "That's the man. He used to live in Clinton, Missouri." This woman then hung up before she could be asked any questions. Police would reach out to their counterparts in Clinton, Missouri, and were unable to find anyone in that town missing that matched the description of this unknown man. Only one other man in the town had the name Roland Owen, but he was alive and well, surprised to hear that he may have been killed in Kansas City. Authorities would then do the same for any potential missing people in the Los Angeles area, including those with the name Roland Owen, but were similarly unsuccessful. Surprisingly, the woman who had been staying in the room next door to this young man, who had reportedly heard the loud noises turn argumentative at around 2 a.m., was named Jean Owen. She hailed from a nearby town called Lee's Summit and had come to Kansas City to visit her boyfriend and go shopping. She was questioned because of the coincidence of her surname being so similar to the victim's. She and her boyfriend were both questioned separately. Both of their stories matched up with one another, and it was determined that neither had any kind of relation to the dead man. The last names being the same seemed to have just been a strange coincidence. Despite their numerous attempts, officials in Kansas City were unable to identify the deceased young man, who they could only theorize had given staff at the hotel president a fake name. They also did not know why he had been at the hotel, nor who he had met up with during his stay there. As they tried to figure out his identity, they also tried to figure out who the mysterious Dawn was, this figure that he had left a note for and spoken to on the telephone. Fingerprints of the decedent were sent to the Department of Justice via wire photo, but did not match up with anyone on record. Photos of the man were published in newspapers and wire services, as were sketches of what he had looked like alive, in the hopes of catching the attention of someone that knew him. However, in the months ahead, nothing would get confirmed, a positive identification ultimately taking years. In the meantime, this strange mystery only deepened. That's on the next episode of Unresolved. Thank you for listening to this episode of Unresolved. I have been your host, Micheal Whelan. Research, writing, and production were also done by myself. If you would like to learn more about this podcast, please check out our website at unresolved.me. That's unresolved.me. You can find an email contact form there, or you can reach out directly by sending your emails to micheal@unresolved.me. That's micheal@unresolved.me. If you would like to support this podcast, you can do so by leaving a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your shows. If you'd like to go further than that, you can financially support the show at Patreon. go to patreon.com/unresolvedpod, where you can get access to bonus episodes and much more. If Patreon isn't your thing, you can become a supporter on certain podcast apps and get the new bonus episodes that come out there. If you want to bypass the whole Patreon or supporter thing, you can also donate directly to the podcast PayPal at theunresolvedpodcast@gmail.com. All donations are greatly appreciated. Thank you for listening, and make sure to subscribe to the podcast wherever you're currently listening to it. Also, if you can, really do try and make sure to leave the podcast a good review. Those really go a long way. As the podcast industry continues to get swallowed up by celebrity shows and corporate interest, I would encourage you to continue supporting independent creators like myself. Not just myself, of course, but it's appreciated. I know a lot has happened since the last time we spoke, especially for us in America, and sometimes a little distance can help. But if any of you need someone to speak to, remember that you're not alone. Reach out to a local crisis center or hotline, or try to dial or text someone at 988. If you need help and you can't get it yourself, you can even try reaching out to me and I'll do my best to get you the resources you need. Anyhow, that's it for me. I hope you all stay safe, stay healthy, and we'll be back with the second half of the story next week. Bye, y'all.